Hey, welcome to this very special Some Geeks Talking. In this, it's just going to be me, Tyler the Collector, and
Jason the Curator.
I'm going to kind of do like a little meeting. Like, we're going to dive into Jason the Curator. We're going to get into his head. We did one of these on the podcast version of the show years ago. It's going to be an abbreviated version, but we just kind of want to get what makes you qualified to be a geek. I'm just going to jump in. So, what were the things you were into early on in life? When did you start collecting comics? I guess because you're the comics guy on the show. To me, you are the curator of comics.
Yeah, that nickname's got its own little past.
Yeah.
That nickname was given to me on another podcast by Pull This Podcast. I think.
Yeah, Pull This Podcast. Yep.
Yep. Which then stemmed all the podcasting stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, and we'll dive into that. So our that story is connected to me in that. So around the same time, I've told this story before. Around the same time, I had went and seen the Impractical Jokers live, and they said in the show, like 10 years ago, we were doing this very same show in front of like 8 people in the audience, and we just worked at it. We're lifelong friends. We just wanted to stick to doing something creative. And then like either right before or right after, you had said, "Hey, I'm on a podcast." And I'm like, holy shit, I didn't even know you could be on a pod. Like I knew like I can make a podcast and put it on SoundCloud and no one will listen to it. But like someone reached out and I can download it on iTunes and you're on a podcast, like that blew my mind. I listened to you on it and like, I'm just like, okay, if these guys are doing it and I was feeling the inspiration from Impractical Jokers, I'm like, I'm doing a podcast.
Yeah. They reached out to me because I mean, one guy was an old instructor of mine. And, he knew I was into comic books. And, when I get a new comic book, I tend to text all my friends and show them like, oh, look what I just got. Even if they don't care, it makes me feel good and gets my serotonin levels up. And,
yeah. It's the bump. You get that
little it's bump. The bump. And, and then that's how, and then he says, hey, he contacted me one day and says, hey, would you, I do a podcast. Yeah, I listen to the podcast. I love it. And because there's not a whole lot of great comic book podcasts out there, at least that I found. And then I showed up and we drank beer in a garage, and I brought a good portion of my collection just to show off because you don't get to meet a whole lot of people that do it other than the nerds at the comic book shop.
Right, and that's like so. You mentioned collection, and that's where like comics and just collecting in general, it's very similar in that like, so when you acquire those books and you get your collection, you get that serotonin bump, the hunt, the find, if you can get it for a good deal, or like you can watch your collection grow in value as it grows in size. And where I can relate to like you wanting to bring and kind of show off, because there's not a lot of potential for showing off what you have when it's sitting at home.
Yeah.
And like in a venue like that, like, yeah, this is my collection. This is what I'm here for. And so is that how they gave you the name?
Yeah. He didn't even tell me like when I went on the show, and then when he posted the show, he put the name Jason the Curator on like the thing for the show.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And that spawned a whole nother level. And, that kind of pushed me to go further.
Yeah.
Because they asked me a lot of questions about how I came across comic books and where I went. And, and I told them that I would scour the internet, long boxes in comic book shops in spare time. And I found a lot of good deals at, like antique stores. And I mean, if you're going to do it, you really got to do a lot of research on them.
And they can be anywhere. Comics are one of those weird things. They can be any thrift store, any like drop stuff off, sell stuff. like even like video game stores will have like the little pop-up ones, not GameStop obviously, but like the little pop-up ones, the little mom and pop ones will have
I
comics.
have I have bought comics off of a table at a guy at um, a farmer's market.
Wow.
Yeah, like just walking through a farmer's market on a Saturday morning with nothing else better to do, and I saw the 25th anniversary of the first appearance of Wolverine,
Wow.
and also I think it was the first appearance of the Laughing Fish with the Joker's Laughing Fish. And I saw it and was like, hey, man, that's sweet. Can I see those? Yeah, sure, go ahead. And I look at them and they're in great shape. And you selling these? Yeah, $5 a piece. Deal. Like,
Yeah.
and they're not, it might not even be worth that. I had no idea, but it was just, I want those.
Yeah. Do you remember your first comic?
My first comic, yes. So my first comic was a local comic by the name of Bone. Jeff Smith, he's a local from Ohio here. But that was what, back in the day when, learning how to read and all that crap, I wasn't a very good reader. And I had a reading tutor, and her name was Mary Gates, I think.
Shout out.
Yeah, shout out to Mary Gates if she's still around. But yeah, she was my reading tutor, and she was the first person that noticed that because I was into art, I was an art kid, and I always struggled on reading chapter books and stuff like that. And to entice me to read, she gave me issue 1 of Bone and said, "Here, check this out. See what you think of this." And I loved it. Loved it. It was the pictures and the words, and it all just, reading finally clicked. And I'm still looking for my issue 1 of Bone. It's really expensive.
Yeah, so it's a weird that, I mean, it's not weird, but it is interesting that, like, I would assume most people's first introduction to comics is one of the big two brands, and it's you like a mom, a family member being like, "Here, I bought these for you at the supermarket," kind of thing.
That later came into play in my life because I remember spinner racks at the drugstore.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of my comics came from, was a spinner rack, because there was comic book shops around, but trying to catch a ride to one.
Yeah, I mean, when you're younger, you're kind of at the mercy of your parents or whoever it can take you, and they're not taking you specialty trips, especially when you're not even into the thing yet. You don't know what that is. Like, we had a local comic book shop that was in bike riding distance when I got to a certain age, but I never, like, it was always so overwhelming to go in there. It's like sensory overload.
It became, there was a card store, like a sports card store that was in bike riding distance when I was able to ride down, to the main drag of where I was at. And then they would have comic books and comic cards and stuff. And that's where all my, allowance went to. And that's where I would collect aluminum cans. And you'd take them to that goat machine.
Yeah.
Like some big machine that had a big picture of a goat on it. And you'd dodge the bees. And you'd throw all your cans in there and give you change. And then that was behind the comic book shop, or the sports card shop, and then you'd go around and take your money in and buy comic cards and comic books that were beat up. And
the bargain bin.
Yeah, the bargain bin.
When you're younger, you don't care about that. Like, you're literally buying this to read it.
Yeah, I got rid of my comic collection when I was younger. I think to buy a video game system or something like that, because it just wasn't, I was like most comic collectors, at one point you realize that girls are more important.
Exactly.
And, growing up is more important. And I regret it now, but I mean, at the same degree with what I know now with collecting, those comics wouldn't have been worth anything because I beat the shit out of them,
Yeah.
So Bone would have been the first comic, but the first, with the first big two, when I was growing up, Marvel, I was a Marvel guy, and X-Men. I mean, it was always X-Men. More specifically with the X-Men, it was the Age of Apocalypse storyline. And since then, I have now collected that comic twice over in single comics. I have 2 collections of it, and it's like, oh my God, it's a stack of comics this thick, probably 40 comic books. And then I've got all the gold copies of it, which are the rarer ones, trade paperback golds. I've got Alpha and Omega, which is the beginning and the end of the story, in gold copies and everything. Yeah, I mean, and the gold copies are cool because they were back in the 90s when they were selling that comic. Each comic book shop would only get 1 copy of the gold Alpha. Okay. So it's a pretty rare, relatively rare comic.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the Age of Apocalypse storyline was my favorite, and that was like the big one that hooked me.
So that's your hook. So that is your mainstream hook.
Yeah.
And then you got out. What brought you back in to collecting comics?
Well, what got me back in? I mean, the movies helped. And there was always just that empty void of, man, I used to have that comic book.
I can speak to that. The classic, like, you're into something, you get out of something, like you say, girls, or like, it's just being a teenager changes. It feels like, well, those are for kids kind of thing. Like, some people, to their credit, will always have that. Like, they secretly will collect or do something like that through their high school years. And some, quite frankly, just will advertise it and get shunned at school.
Well, I remember and I've said this 100 times, I remember you might get your ass kicked for reading comic books growing up,
Yeah.
And now you can almost use it as a pickup line, although it doesn't work that well. But yeah, I don't know what really got me back into it other than I needed something else in my life. And I would see these things and go, man, I used to have that book.
I think there's something
nostalgia thing.
Yeah, there's something to you hit an age where you're like, I don't care what people think about what I like. And I really liked those. And it makes, like, the nostalgia is its own, like, if the dopamine hit of collecting is a thing, imagine like condensing that into like its purest form of like that nostalgia dopamine hit is the best feeling in the world.
It really is. And like, there's not much that can describe when you're foraging through a long box at a comic book shop and or a flea market or anywhere, and you find that one comic that you've been looking for. Like, I told you the Age of Apocalypse stuff. I had set rules to collecting that storyline for myself, and I don't know why. Like, I don't remember laying them out. They were just in my head, and like, I found all those books in long boxes.
Oh yeah, so this is your rule of I have to find it in the wild in a long box. Yeah.
And once I did it, once I completed it, I sat there and I was like, maybe that was it. Like, that's what I wanted. I wanted that entire set, and then went, well, I've done it. Fuck, I've done it twice.
Yeah.
I guess I need more. And then I started going, and my last resort is the internet, because it's just too easy. Type it in, there it is. Right. There's 800 different copies of what I'm looking for. And it depends on, what I need and when I need it is.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain times where you're like, all right, I've been looking for months.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
just
with
gonna,
it.
yeah.
Uh,
I want to know, like, now do you read as much now as you did, or is it more
no,
I just collect?
I do read, um, but my reading is very. I'm not going to say boring, but I will say boring for lack of better words or descriptions, because I only read specific things. I read Batman. I read Hellblazer or Constantine, where right now it's Hellblazer. Justice League Dark. Um, I read a lot of the Black Label DC stuff. And as I've grown older, I'm more of a DC guy than a Marvel guy. Like I still collect Marvel, but it's mainly stuff to complete my collection, or oh man, I really want that one, you know. But I can't tell you the last time that I can't tell you the last time I picked up an X-Men book to read it.
Right.
You know, like I can tell you I pick up X-Men books to collect them, but I haven't read them in a long time.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't do as much reading as I probably should, but I still read.
Yeah.
Um, but like being an adult, it's hard to find the time. And, you know, like I'll go to the comic book shop and I'll see guys buying stacks of comics this big. And it's like, man, you're really reading all that stuff? Man, that's crazy.
Yeah. So I guess comics are almost like a really interesting thing to collect because it can serve two things. You can consume it as a medium of entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
or you can just collect it.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, comics they've went through their ups and downs in popularity and sales and struggling, and I mean DC just
90s almost
essentially
destroyed
laid
them.
off everybody.
Yeah.
But
He's almost destroyed it.
I don't think they'll ever fully go away.
No way. There's too much money in it.
Even still, when they aren't making billions, they're still making millions, which is an industry that will sustain itself essentially.
Yeah, I don't think comic books are a medium that you can't take away. You know, one, if you take them away, well, then all the back issues are going to skyrocket because everyone's going to freak out and want them.
Yeah.
And even people, you know, it's just like when Marvel or DC reboots their universes, which they do all the time.
Every decade, it seems like.
You always see a surge of people come into the comic book shop and order 5 number ones of every single comic.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, guys, you're not going to make a fortune on this. Like it's really hard to make a lot of money at comic books.
What was the first issue of a comic that you bought because of, like, this is potentially going to be worth something? And follow up, did you get burned on it, or did it actually work out for you?
I'll start this with my biggest regret was I bought the first appearance of the Swamp Thing, and it was my pride and joy. And then I got to a point where I needed some money, and I sold it.
Mm.
And then about maybe a year later, they came out with the TV show.
Oh.
And now I can't afford that comic book.
Yeah.
I bought one in particular comic to sell, but I can't bring myself to sell it, which is the first appearance of Miles Morales.
Yeah, that's a cool one to have.
I've never been I love Spider-Man. I think he's awesome, but I've never been a Spider-Man collector.
Yeah.
I came across Ultimate Alliance issue 4, whatever the hell it's called, but the first appearance of Miles Morales for an amazing price. And now that comic book is like $400 and some.
Wow.
$600, and it's like, I don't really want to sell it.
Like, you can hold on to that, and it's just
I like it there.
Yeah.
I'm not a big seller, so
uh,
I go ahead.
did you buy any of the Black Bag Death of Superman? Or were you out of comics at that point?
Buddy, I could still tell you where I was when Superman died.
Yeah, exactly.
I have the black bag. I have I have the white bag. But the black bag, I remember where I was and who I was with when it happened.
Wow. Would you say that's one of the more notorious, like, mainstream media covered it? Everyone came in and said, I'm buying 10 copies because I'm sending my kids to college. And then now it's like a $5 book or something like that.
So at the time that that book came out, I wasn't collecting, I was reading.
Okay.
But I have an unopened black bag that I actually just recently got. But let's see, God, I can't even remember what year it was, but I was at a Chi-Chi's restaurant in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And my friend, it was a family friend at the time. His name was Mark, and he came. Our families were having dinner, and he came in with that book and went, "Dude, Superman's dead." And I remember just like, what? Like, that was like the biggest shock. And
especially at your age.
at the age I was, it was prime. It was better than Hulk Hogan, doing something.
Yeah.
You mean to tell me Superman died? That's crazy. That's impossible.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I remember. I can remember the moment I learned about it.
That's awesome. Now, so we're going to fast forward some. So you ended up going to art school.
Mm-hmm.
What was I know the ending to the story, but what was the goal going to art school?
I wanted to be an industrial artist with industrial design. I wanted to do special effects in movies. But when I went to that school, I ended up partying too much, and you're away from home and no one there to tell you no. And I ended up dropping out of that school. And then, now, fast forward after that, you have kids, and
then even you and a couple of your buddies started up Truck Stop Comics.
Yeah, and then me and my buddy Mark and my other buddy Ryan, I've been running around with Mark since we were in kindergarten. Ryan, I think we met Ryan when we were in 5th grade. I think he had just moved to town. And I remember when I think it was my friend Brandon. It was either Brandon or Mark. They're like, dude, there's this kid at Reset, you need to meet him. Because I was the big drawler Mark was a big drawler too. Like, you need to meet this kid. He's drawing something that's amazing. All right, and then we had recess. And then they took me over to Ryan, who's sitting by himself drawing a picture of Lord Zed from the
from Power Rangers.
Power Rangers, and it was like, oh my God, we're 5th grade. It was amazing. He's still to this day is an amazing artist, and that was my first interaction with Ryan. Instantly, we were friends. And so then fast forward after high school and all this, just a couple years ago, actually, is when we finally got back together. All of us got back together, and we self-printed our own comic book.
Yeah, that's awesome. How'd that feel to actually have a physical?
It wasn't a great comic book.
But how did it feel to have that actual thing in your hand?
It was pretty awesome. I'm not gonna lie. It was a great moment, a milestone moment of something that we talked about since we were little kids, and finally we did it. And it's not a great comic by any means, but it's a comic book, and it's something that we did. We have our names on it,
Mm-hmm.
and no one can ever take that away from me. It's just like, and then the second comic that I did, I was able to find that in a long box at a comic book shop, just foraging through, and I pulled it up and I went, "Oh my God, that's my comic book." Now, it's never going to get sold, but it was
Just to see it out in the wild, as we say.
yeah. But there was not the first moments of making that first comic book with my friends was probably, I mean, it's up there with, having your first kid, getting married, and, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's there with that. And, that's a moment that I'll never forget.
That's awesome. We're going to end this with a little like, what's in store for the future of you? Your collecting, your comic book collecting, Truck Stop Comics.
Truck Stop Comics is kind of on haywire right now. It turns out I'm a terrible boss. It would be nice to have everybody get back together and do some stuff.
It's rough.
It's hard doing something creative,
Right,
with your friends and your family.
right.
I don't know the future of it. I would love to know the future of it. I do know that I can't be in control of things to that, or take things that seriously again. I want to have. I took a lot. For me, I took a lot of the fun out of it. So that's, I guess, I don't know. That when I say that out loud, it makes it sound like a regret. No, I love it very much. I've put a lot of effort into it, and I know my friends have too. And I think one day maybe it'll come back. I got a comic book that needs to get done through Truck Stop, whether it has to come out eventually, because other people are, waiting on it.
Right.
But eventually, it's going to get back. I'll get back to work on that. I've had some issues that I haven't been able to work through with drawing, and then there is some more comic book talk in the works. Hopefully this idea pans out.
Yeah, I know what you're referencing, and we won't spoil it,
Yeah.
because there's nothing worse than hyping and then something falling through, because it's in the very early stages.
And that, like, even with that one, man, like, I'm having a hard time mentally with, oh man, does that go under the Truck Stop imprint, or does that go under something new?
Right.
I just don't know yet.
My advice always has been, you're kind of your own brand at a certain level.
Yeah.
And because you started your comic book group or company, your brand, Truck Stop Comics, essentially the same time as I started Some Guys Talking and the SGT brand.
Absolutely.
And the paths were like, they're so mirrored in the ups and downs, the highs of like creating something, and the lows of the headbutting of, that's not how I've envisioned it. Well, that's not how I envision, and the fighting. So less is more sometimes when you're creating something. And
yeah, it's just, if I could offer any advice to anybody that wants to create something, less is definitely more. And don't get wrapped up in a name so much as doing something you love. Like, I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things that I learned with Truck Stop was, like, hey man, don't get wrapped up in a name and marketing and trying to make something bigger than what it should be, when it should have just been, look, this is something we're doing as fun.
Yeah. And along the same lines of advice, something that I think a lot of people, when they are a group of friends, it's 98% of these things spark with a group of friends. They're like, hey, we should do this. whether it be a podcast, a YouTube show, make a comic book, or make a movie, make anything. And that's when you kind of can separate, like, it's hard to separate, is what I'm trying to say, friendship through, it's not really business, because it's such a small thing, and to call it business is insulting true business. But like, I also would advise, don't be afraid if it doesn't work out with your friends, because you'll meet, like, I wasn't this close to you.
No.
Until, like, you start to realize, like, maybe people you meet through this who you end up doing things with. With Aviary Law, I did not even know who he was until I had the show, and then met him through it.
Yeah.
So there's always those, take the risk with your friends, but don't think that it has to end if it ends with them. If you still have the drive, you can go do it with someone else.
Yeah, because when all this started, man, you and I, we knew each other.
Right.
We weren't close like that. And then, you know, we'd spend hours on the phone talking.
Right.
Oh man, you know, where you say the similarities are just, they're parallel. I mean, they're almost the same.
Yeah.
Collecting wise, I got to keep going.
Yeah.
I have to. I plan on making a pretty decent addition to the collection this week here. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'll ever stop collecting comic books. It's something. I'm not a rich man, so I mean, it's like the one thing that I can pass down to my kids.
Yeah.
I know, like, I just redesigned my comic book wall, and I've got my son was really big. My oldest son was really big into the Super Sons, which was Batman's kid and Superman's kid. And I just got the first appearance of that, hung it on the wall. My son was really excited to see his comic book on the wall.
Awesome.
And then, but yeah, I mean, comics are just something that I've never grew out of, and
That's good.
So
I think everybody needs that thing.
Yeah.
But we're gonna end this little mini episode, and we ended up doing, it's pretty much just comic talk. But I love that, because we're gonna have to do these in the future. We'll dive into, maybe we'll talk about Batman, because your affinity for Batman is off the charts. And I mean, I don't even, you mentioned him once in this episode. No. So we didn't really scratch the surface on all the other aspects of your geekdom, but comics would be the one thing on the show that separates us the most, is your knowledge for comics. And you have the history with your personal comic creator yourself, which is exciting. So please hit the like and subscribe button. That helps out a ton. Head over to Aviary Law on Twitch. Follow me, Tyler the Collector, on Instagram, and one day we'll get this guy back going on social media.
I mean, the social media still exists. I'm not very active on it.
All right.
Truck Stop Comics and you know, Jason Gilmer.
All right. This sounds good. Have a good week.
You too.